Welcome along, Strange Historians. This is the Strange History Podcast. Before I begin, please like and share this episode and subscribe to my channel and hit the notification bell. Oh, and do me a favor and check out the links below to learn how to support my channel. So now, sit back and pour yourself a cup of coffee or a tankard of tea or a mug of mead or a chalice of cider or a flagon filled with any beverage of your choice and join your fellow strange historians around the campfire. This was published in the Washington Post on July 8th of 1888, and the headline is Story of Murder Bay, something about a locality now almost forgotten. A dreaded spot where for many years disorder and crime flourished without let or hindrance, now it is as safe as any other section of the city. To a person whose acquaintance with Washington does not extend back over a longer period than 10 years, it is almost impossible to realize what the same city 30 years ago and less was. Nowhere in the world, probably, have such rapid improvements been made as in Washington. And the now beautiful sections with smooth, clean streets, magnificent parks, and handsome houses that abound in almost every direction have really been made within the last 20 years. The city before that was as little like its present condition as could well be imagined. Then the streets were unpaved, except certain of the principal thoroughfares. The houses were, for the most part, mean and straggling, while the moral atmosphere was almost in accord with the condition of the town itself. Gambling establishments, some of the highest order, and descending by gradations to dens of the lowest character, where life itself was frequently sacrificed on the turning of a card. Thieves and unprincipled men and women, as ready to cut a throat as pick a pocket, flourished and walked the streets in certain sections in open daylight, while at night they frequented the haunts of vice and selected their victims from among the unsophisticated without fear of law or justice. In those sections, it was unsafe for anyone with the slightest appearance of respectability to enter after nightfall. There were, of course, the respectable sections, and numbers of people lived there and mingled in society who knew little or nothing of the darker localities except as they were brought to their attention through the newspapers. But to the people who saw a downtown life, as it may be termed, after the town was buried in darkness, except for the straggling rays from dim street lamps or the light from the saloons and gambling places, Washington was a wild and weird place. Under such conditions, these localities, where life was hardly safe after nightfall, sprang into existence and flourished, and the darkest crimes known in the criminal annals of the city were committed. Of those sections, probably the worst was Murder Bay, which was located between Ohio Avenue and the old canal that ran along a little south of B Street. It consisted of rows of little frame shanties, occupied mostly by Negroes, but with a sprinkling of whites of the worst character. There were no pavements in this locality. The water soaking through the canal kept the ground continuously wet, and the feet of the people passing churned the soft ground into black and odorous mud, making even the ground consistent with the depravity that existed there. A house larger than the rest, known as Bull's Head, stood where the Ebbett House stables now are, at the corner of 13th Street and Ohio Avenue, and marked the northeastern boundary of Murder Bay. It was, like the rest of the houses of the locality, the resort of thieves, both white and black, and women of low character. The people were little more than brutes, and the police, if they were able to confine them to the limits of the Bay, were content to allow them to live there as they pleased, preying upon each other. From Bull's Head, Murder Bay extended westward across 14th Street into what is now the Monument Grounds, until it reached what was then known as Bryantown, a locality little better than that of Murder Bay itself, except that there were more whites residing there, and that the brawls which occurred did not so frequently result in loss of life. South of these localities were, as now, the government reservations, but they were unimproved wastes, occupied only by cattle. Between the reservations, now the grounds of the agricultural department, and through Murder Bay ran the canal, a muddy, foul-smelling thread of water, along which the canal boats passed slowly on their way to and from the wharves, at the old Center Market, and along B Street. Such were the surroundings of this section, and the men and women who lived there, when the opening of the war brought to this city hordes of soldiers from the north, droves of Negroes and renegades from the south, and with them the thieves and sharpers who profited from the general confusion that ensued. It was then that Murder Bay rose to the importance that characterized it for the next 5 years, and made even the police shun it as much as possible. It is generally believed that Murder Bay found its origin about this period when the war opened, but as a fact it had then existed for a number of years before that time. With the large influx of strangers, however, many of them from the lowest classes of other cities, and a large number of them Negroes, set wild by their new-born freedom and the incendiary efforts of northern crooks, who used them as tools for their own profit. The character of Murder Bay was changed for the worse, and it assumed an individuality in the matter of crime and depravity that distinguished it from every other section where criminals abounded. Previous to this period, the term Murder Bay had been more or less a misnomer. How it had originated, no one knew. But while the locality abounded in depravity, it was not until the opening of the war that it really deserved the title it had assumed. One of the first murders about this time that brought attention to Murder Bay was the killing of a Negro named Rideout. He had gone into Murder Bay with his week's wages in his pocket, and was found the next morning lying on the bank of the canal with his throat cut from ear to ear. No one knew how it occurred, nor did the efforts of the police result in finding a single clue to his murderer. Then began a series of crimes which continued for the next 4 or 5 years. Men were known to go into Murder Bay and were not heard of again until their bodies were discovered in the canal or found buried in ash dumps. Robberies of the most daring nature occurred in rapid succession. Men were carried from the streets into this locality and stripped of whatever they possessed, lucky indeed if they escaped with their lives, while fights between blacks and whites were constantly occurring. The locality abounded in dingy saloons, and the soldiers flocked there in numbers and added to the general disorder as they fought among themselves, crazed with the vile whiskey that was served them. How many men lost their lives there, it is impossible to estimate. The police were powerless to suppress the disorder or to detect the criminals, and many of the crimes were not even investigated. From 1860 to 1865, this condition continued when the close of the war accelerated the improvement of the city, and the locality began to be filled up with the machine shops and lumber yards that exist there at present. The filling up of the old canal ended the work that had been already begun, and about 1873, Murder Bay had become a thing of the past. One of the last of the horrors discovered there was the finding of the body of a young white woman buried beneath an ash heap. Her body was never identified, nor were her murderers ever discovered. The murder of a Negro, known as Black Dick, followed soon after this, but in this instance, the murderers were brought to justice. And with their punishment, the police established their authority and have maintained it ever since. So that today, the once disreputable locality south of the avenue is as orderly at night as the avenue itself. A feature of Old Murder Bay was the Church of Old Brother Willis, as he was termed. It was located on 14th Street, just above the old canal. And there, the darkies, without making the slightest pretense of being religious, used to congregate on Sundays and in the evening, more for excitement than anything else. The services were invariably interrupted by fights, and while the razors were flashing in the air, the majority of the congregation would go out of the windows carrying the sashes with them. Bryantown, which as stated before was located at the western extremity of Murder Bay, had a rather romantic ending years before Murder Bay was wiped out of existence. At this time, the volunteer fire companies assumed to be, to some extent, the regulators of morals and the principal lawbreakers of the city at the same time. They were a wild, reckless set, but meant well, except when fighting other companies. One of the engine houses was located near where Allison Naylor's stables now stand, and the ringleader of the gang that assembled there was a man from Baltimore named Moses Bronson. Moses's gang was known as the Rangers, and they prided themselves on never refusing a fight. One day, while Moses and his gang were standing in front of the engine house, a lady passed, weeping bitterly. "Sissy, you seem to be in trouble," said Moses, stopping her with the manner of a cowboy. The lady was frightened and attempted to run away, but Moses stopped her and insisted on knowing why she was crying. She called him a brute, accused him of making light of her trouble, but finally told him what the matter was. Her husband, she said, was spending all his time and money with a woman in one of the disreputable houses in Bryantown. "Leave the matter to me," said the leader of the Rangers, and the lady did so. Half an hour later, the Rangers were in Bryantown, and Bryantown was in flames, while the faithless husband was fleeing across the monument grounds in the direction of Van Ness Park. No one attempted to distinguish the flames, nor were any inquiries made concerning the incendiaries, and the burning of Bryantown was regarded as a good riddance of a very great evil. When Murder Bay was finally cleaned out, the two worst localities that the city had ever known disappeared. And so, this concludes this episode of the Strange History Podcast. If you enjoy this episode, kindly like, share, and subscribe, and hit the notification bell. If you want to support my research and hear more shows like this, please click on the link below so you can see how you can make a donation directly to me, and also join me on other platforms where I post exclusive content. And of course, I will appreciate it if you could leave a super thanks below. Kindly be kind to all non-human animals, and please don't eat them. They don't like it. Take my word for it. And please do yourself a favor and go to a local shelter and adopt a cat or a dog. You and they will be very glad that you did. Until next time, I wish you safe travels on all your journeys.